It's a typical summer morning in New York City. Tourists and commuters arrive from the suburbs into Grand Central Station, packing into subway trains, making their way to the city's world-famous landmarks, hurrying off to workplaces in densely packed office towers. But just offshore, stress is building beneath the murky waters of the Atlantic. America's busiest metropolis is unsuspecting and unprepared. Suddenly, the seafloor ruptures along an ancient fault line. It's a 7.1 magnitude earthquake centered off Coney Island, equal in power to the 1989 quake that rocked San Francisco. It shakes New York City to its core, turning sidewalks into scenes of terror, entire neighborhoods into piles of rubble, and completely paralyzing the city. This isn't a scene from a disaster movie. It's the science of an earthquake in New York. A massive earthquake centered near New York City would create an unprecedented disaster, leaving thousands dead and block after block of buildings collapsed or destroyed. It could take decades for the city and the nation to fully recover from such a devastating blow.
An earthquake of a lethal magnitude in New York City would make 9/11 pale by comparison. We lost 3 buildings on 9/11. They collapsed, and it was chaos. A significant earthquake would cause that to happen 1,000 times over.
The question is, do scientists really think it could happen here? That's what veteran New York news anchor Chuck Scarborough wondered after reporting on a devastating earthquake in Armenia in 1988.
And what really startled me was that there was no debate. Most scientific issues have discussion about them. There seemed to be no debate about whether New York City and other cities along the East Coast were eventually going to be hit with a serious earthquake. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. Now, they argue about when, but not if. And that's what was so startling about it.
The idea that there could be a killer earthquake in New York City seems to fly in the face of accepted science. Almost all earthquakes around the world are generated by the process called plate tectonics. Rather than being one solid mass, Earth's crust is broken up into roughly 30 segments. And these plates, as they're known, are constantly on the move, floating along on top of a layer of molten rock at up to 5 inches per year. Along the boundaries of these plates are where you find thousands of cracks in the crust, known as faults. The most infamous example is the San Andreas Fault, which forms part of the border of the giant Pacific and North American plates. Living near these plate boundaries is dangerous because inevitably the plates slip past, over, or under each other along these fault lines in a catastrophic release of pent-up stress, a terrifying event we call an earthquake. But it's hard to find a place farther from an active plate boundary than New York City. In fact, it sits almost geographically in the middle of the North American plate, halfway between the San Andreas Fault and the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. It's seemingly out of the danger zone. Yet surprisingly, scientists have discovered there are faults here too, and lots of them. It turns out New York is sitting on a ticking time bomb. Faults surround and crisscross the city, cutting across vital water pipes, tunnels, and beneath major buildings. Rutgers University geologist Alec Gates is leading the charge to map the fault lines in the New York region. It's a challenge because most faults don't have obvious visual evidence, like a crack in the earth. But with the trained eyes of an experienced scientist, he sees clues that the average person would easily miss.
It's not easy to see faults in New York City. They're covered with cement, with blacktop, with buildings. We're standing here at the 125th Street station in Manhattan. And as you can see, I'm standing way up high on a overpass, okay? And this place is where the subway comes out of the ground and becomes an L train just for a little while, just over this little valley at 125th Street, then disappears back into the subway again. The reason that there's this valley here is because there's a fault that runs right underneath the middle of the street here.
Over millions of years, the fault line that crosses Manhattan here weakened the rock, allowing it to erode away into a valley. Riders on the number 1 train and drivers coming up the sloping streets in this part of town have no idea that they're traveling right through an ancient fault zone. The reason these faults are here is that plate tectonics has been going on for hundreds of millions of years. Although it's in the middle of the North American plate now, New York City was once located along a plate boundary, and these faults under Manhattan were once as active as their California cousins.
These faults were created probably at the time when the Atlantic Ocean began to really open up. So we're talking about the Cretaceous period, 65 million years ago. At that point, these were a lot of strike-slip faults, similar to the San Andreas, and then they probably became relatively inactive.
The fact that faults like the one running under 125th Street are so old should give New Yorkers peace of mind. Most of the earthquake action does tend to happen on active plate boundaries in places like California. But scientists believe these ancient East Coast faults have set the stage for a violent reawakening.
When you have plates moving around the planet, although you would like to think all the stress is taken up on the edges where you have the boundaries or margins of the plate, the problem is these interactions of the plate actually transmit some stress through the plate.
This means that as the plate boundaries are squeezed at the edges, any weak spots in the middle of the plate can potentially crack again, triggering an earthquake. The idea that earthquakes can happen anywhere, not just along plate boundaries, isn't just a theory. In fact, the largest earthquakes in the recorded history of the United States happened not in California, but dead center in the country along Missouri's New Madrid Fault. This fault actually produced a handful of earthquakes greater than magnitude 7 in a 3-month span between 1811 and 1812. 2 of the quakes are believed to have been 8.0s or greater on the Richter scale, shaking cities as far away as Richmond, Virginia, almost 900 miles to the east, and triggering landslides that altered the course of the Mississippi River. In New York itself, more than 400 earthquakes have been recorded in the last 300 years, ranking the state 3rd in earthquake activity east of the Mississippi. There was a 5.2 in 1737, a 4.5 in 1847, a 4.4 in 1848, and as recently as 2001, a pair of quakes centered right in Manhattan, each measuring around 2.5 on the Richter scale. But the largest quake in recent history had its epicenter under the ocean, just offshore of the city.
The last big earthquake was in 1884, right offshore here from Coney Island. It was about 12 miles out to sea. That earthquake had a 5.5 magnitude. It did a lot of damage up here in Coney Island, in Brooklyn, in Queens, and all the way over in New Jersey. It knocked over steeples, pulled houses off their foundations, and did a lot of damage.
Despite the damage, there were few reported casualties from the 1884 quake. Yet scientists believe even a 5.5 would do massive damage to modern-day New York. With its densely packed grid of streets and fragile infrastructure.
Things happen in New York City all the time where things break and fall apart by their own accord without any earthquakes. So you had the West Side Highway collapse a few years ago, and rocks go spewing out all over, shutting the road down, and there was no earthquake. You have steam pipes exploding, and there was no earthquake. You have falling apart trestles and bridges where you could see the cement peeling off of them. And all you have to do is put an earthquake through those places, and they will be destroyed.
Scientists estimate a quake of magnitude 5.5 could happen every 50 to 100 years. A more powerful one, around 6.0, might jolt the area every 400 to 500 years. A recent study predicted that a larger quake, measuring 7.0 or greater on the Richter scale, might strike every 3,400 years. That may sound like a long time, but the catch is, nobody knows when the last quake of that size hit the region. The clock may already be running out.
So you could actually wind up with something maybe on that level, and if it hit New York City, that would be a big earthquake. It could happen tomorrow, it could happen 100 years from now.
New York City faces the very real possibility that someday it could be struck by a killer earthquake. And a study released in 2003 found that a magnitude 7 quake centered near the city would kill more than 6,500 people. Almost 13,000 buildings in the metro area would be completely destroyed, leaving 200,000 homeless. There wouldn't be enough hospital beds available to treat all the wounded, and not enough water to fight the estimated 1,200 fires that would break out.
Gas-fueled fires and collapses of buildings and a failed water system, all combining to create this holocaust of death and destruction throughout the 5 boroughs of New York. I don't want to be an alarmist here, but from what I've learned, those are the genuine dangers of a serious earthquake.
All along New York's steel and brick canyons, the disaster plays out in 1,000 terrifying ways. From the very public scenes of epic terror to the private dramas. On the Upper East Side, the shaking jars the residents of a 20-story apartment building. The violent sloshing of water inside the rooftop water tower sends the tank crashing to the street. Every structure in the city responds to the earthquake in its own way, depending on how it's built. Author and journalist Stephen S. Ross is an expert on New York's buildings and infrastructure. A physicist by training, he's one of the world's leading authorities on why structures fail. Looking at Manhattan from across the East River, Ross sees a vision of disaster.
When I look out towards Manhattan, I actually see a lot of problems. Take a look at this low, unreinforced rock wall. That could collapse in a major earthquake, blocking the highway here. Notice the buildings built on platforms out over the drive itself. If the earthquake hit just right, it could collapse the platform that building sits on. During an earthquake, I would not want to be on the Roosevelt Island tram.
For more than 30 years, the Roosevelt Island Tramway has been performing its 3,000-foot-long high-wire act across the East River, ferrying commuters between Queens, Roosevelt Island, and Manhattan. Dangling 250 feet above the water, each car can pack in up to 125 people. In the best-case scenario, you would be in for a scary thrill ride. In the worst case,
if the big one hit when the tram was right on top of a pylon, the pylon could collapse. And if the pylon toppled, that would be almost certain death for the people inside the tram. The pylon itself is fairly light. Think of it as a lollipop stick. If I wave the stick back and forth after I've eaten the lollipop, I can do that forever, right? But if there's a nice heavy lollipop on top of that stick, if I whip the stick too much, the stick may break. Well, the tram car is basically the lollipop, and the pylon is basically the stick. If it shakes too much, everything collapses.
Just beyond the tramway is the 59th Street Bridge. Of all the city's 21 major bridges, this one is most likely to collapse in an earthquake.
You look at the bridge, it looks fairly solid. It has this web of steel around it. However, the steel is almost entirely vertical. You can see that you don't have a lot of bracing against those verticals. When you get an earthquake, the wave of energy moves the beams this way. If there were actually an earthquake at Richter 6 or Richter 7, which is really about the maximum credible earthquake we think of around here, the bridge would collapse.
Ultimately, all of this devastation is dealt by the seismic waves radiating out from the epicenter of the earthquake. Scientists have a good idea how these waves work.
The best way to understand earthquake waves is like throwing a rock in a pond. There's a radial motion of the waves as they come out of that epicenter and move away from it in all directions. So the shaking takes place close to where the epicenter is. Farther you get away, less shaking, less damage.
How much damage these waves do to a building depends both on how the building was constructed and what type of ground it sits on. Anchored to tough rock, it will likely survive. Rooted in soft soil, the picture is far more grim.
So you have these waves, and the surface waves travel along the planet like ocean waves. Now, when they travel through hard rock, it's tough to make hard rock do what an ocean wave does. But if they travel through soft sediments can do the same as ocean waves, and they transmit the damage much more.
Luckily, much of Manhattan is built on solid ground. The island is comprised of a 450 million year old layer of tough rock called Manhattan schist. New York's skyline would never have grown so tall without the ability to anchor foundations into this sturdy bedrock. Apart from some outcroppings in city parks, it's hard to get a good look at Manhattan's bedrock up close. But Grand Central Terminal has the deepest basement in all of New York City. A secret place that is off limits to the public.
We talk a lot about bedrock. What is it? Well, here it is. We're 13 or 14 stories below street level. This is what Manhattan is built on. And this is very, very solid. In an earthquake, this stuff is really your best friend. This is the stuff that's going to move the least. It's the softer rock that comes in contact with it that's going to vibrate more in an earthquake. It's going to go up and down and sideways.
In some places, like Times Square, New York's bedrock is only 18 feet below the surface. That's the good news. But there are plenty of parts of the city built on shakier ground, thanks to the glacier that covered this area starting about 20,000 years ago. As it retreated across the land that is now Manhattan at the end of the last ice age, it deposited glacial sediments in all of the low-lying areas. So where are those areas full of soft sediments? New York's skyline tells the tale.
You'll notice this New York skyline has large buildings uptown, and as you go down to the business district, there's also large buildings. But in between, in the area of around Greenwich Village or Chinatown, the houses are much lower. And so that's what gives you that dip in the New York skyline. And in that area, buildings could not be built high, and it's because you have those soft sediments underneath there. If an earthquake came through there, there would be more shaking and more potential for damage in that area than there would be in the areas where you have bedrock near the surface.
The other danger zones include the Upper East Side, home to roughly 250,000 people, and much of the shoreline, including the FDR Drive, a major highway along the east side of the city that's traveled by more than 150,000 vehicles each day. Ground motions in these areas can be as much as double what would be felt on more solid ground. When the shaking starts, something especially dangerous can happen in these shoreline areas built on sandy soil that has a high water content. It's a process called liquefaction. As the ground starts to shake, water pressure rises in the soil, allowing the individual sand particles to float freely and act strangely like a liquid. The soil loses all stiffness and strength.
And liquefaction can undermine building foundations and knock buildings over, knock any structure over, because it kind of turns the surface into quicksand, into a mud that doesn't support foundations.
In a New York earthquake, sandy soil could prove to be the Achilles heel for the iconic Brooklyn Bridge. Every structure responds differently to the shaking from an earthquake. Suspension bridges, for example, are designed to roll with the punches. So the Brooklyn Bridge should survive a New York earthquake intact.
There is, however, a problem. One of the two piers, one of the two towers that actually hold up the Brooklyn Bridge is actually built on sand.
The bridge was designed to have both piers anchored in solid rock, but workers excavating for the pier on the Manhattan side kept getting stuck and had to call off their efforts 30 feet shy of bedrock. So the bridge has 1 foot on solid ground and 1 foot in the sand. These piers were designed to stand up perfectly straight, but a large earthquake could leave one leaning precariously.
If you really got up to that maximum earthquake, a Richter 7, let's say, one of the piers could topple, and that would destroy the bridge.
"5 miles upriver from the Brooklyn Bridge, sandy soil also plagues the United Nations headquarters building. The shaking here would twist the iconically thin UN building, ejecting razor-sharp shards of glass into the plaza below. But the building's steel superstructure should still survive. Other buildings won't be so lucky.
If an earthquake happened in New York City, I would expect that the buildings that would be hit the hardest would be what we call unreinforced masonry structures. Masonry has 3 big strikes against it. It's stiff so that it attracts force. It's weak so it reaches its capacity quickly, and it's non-ductile, means when it reaches its capacity, it fractures.
Unreinforced masonry buildings are structures with walls of just brick and mortar, without steel bars to strengthen them. Their fragility is obvious when you look at vintage buildings in New York that are being rehabbed. The old brick walls have to be propped up to prevent collapse. Unreinforced masonry, plus soft soils, is a recipe for disaster. A disaster that could reach its horrifying crescendo in Brooklyn and Queens. Nearly 5 million of New York City's 8 million people are crammed into these 2 boroughs.
When you're talking about Queens and Brooklyn, which is actually where most New Yorkers live, that's nothing more than a giant sandbar. We're on a street in Brooklyn, in Park Slope. As you can see, the buildings look very solid, but they're really not. You have structures that are basically built on sand. Sand goes down 50 feet or more in places several hundred feet. The original builders of these older buildings did not sink pilings. They just put a footing down about 5 feet below the street level that's current today and built the house on top of it. The buildings themselves are unreinforced masonry construction. What that means is there's no real connection between the bricks that make up the inner structural walls and the beams that support the floors. The wood beams are actually fitted into sockets in the brick wall, and if the buildings move during an earthquake, really only has to move an inch or 2 to to collapse the floor.
Even in a moderate earthquake, masonry structures are the first to fall. The walls tend to collapse outward, dumping piles of rubble onto the street.
If this were a huge earthquake, a 6.5, 6.87, none of these buildings would survive. This would not be a happy street.
On a single densely packed block of brownstones, the death toll from collapsing buildings could easily be in the hundreds. A toll that would be multiplied across the city, because the frightening fact is, the majority of buildings in New York are built of unreinforced masonry. A total of more than 29,000 structures. By comparison, San Francisco has less than 2,000 of these highly vulnerable buildings. New York City simply isn't built to withstand an earthquake. There was no seismic building code in place until the late 1990s. The perils of this became especially clear in the late 1980s, when two earthquakes 10 months apart provided a stunning contrast. In 1988, a 6.9 magnitude quake rocked Armenia. More than 25,000 people were killed as entire towns collapsed in heaps of rubble.
Oh my God, we're having an earthquake. Wait a minute, hold on.
Less than a year later, a more powerful 7.1 magnitude quake hit the San Francisco Bay Area. And yet, less than 70 people died. Scientists attribute the difference in the death toll to California's strict seismic building codes. Simply put, earthquakes don't kill people. Falling debris and collapsing structures do. And when it comes to earthquake engineering, New York has a lot more in common with Armenia than San Francisco. If a killer earthquake targets New York City, its appetite for destruction will be easily filled. The composition of the Earth's crust in the east makes it so that even a moderate quake could do massive damage here. In the west, where the crust is still being formed by active tectonic forces, the rocks are younger, softer, and more fractured. So earthquake waves radiating out from the epicenter have to navigate a maze of cracks and faults that absorb much of their energy. In the east, the crust is old and solid with few fractures, so seismic waves have a clear, efficient path to travel. This means a quake in New York can shake an area 100 times larger than the same size quake in California.
I'd rather be in San Francisco during a magnitude 7 than New York during a magnitude 6. And that's simply because you don't have to be really close to the fault in the east to feel the effects of an earthquake. You could have your building knocked down even if it's some distance from the fault. In the west, the effects of the earthquake are much more concentrated along fault lines.
If you're in the Big Apple when the big one hits, what type of building would offer you the most protection? The construction of the building and what type of ground it sits on are important, but there's also a hidden science dictating which structures are more likely to collapse. Just like strings on an instrument vibrate at different pitches depending on their thickness and rigidity, all structures have what's called a natural period of vibration when shaken. The length of the period, how far it will bend before snapping back the other way, depends mostly on the height of the building. Short buildings are more rigid, so they have shorter periods. Tall buildings are more flexible and have longer periods.
So imagine you have a short building, and right next door to that you have a tall building. The short building is about 6 or 7 stories, the tall building about 60 or 70 stories. The tall building has a much longer resonance period than the shorter building.
The real danger of building collapse comes when the period of the seismic waves matches the innate vibrational period of a structure. When that happens, the vibrations of the building are amplified. It's like a parent pushing a child on a swing. If the parent gives a push just as the child reaches the apex of the backswing, the child will swing much higher. This is called mechanical resonance, and in an earthquake, it can bend the structural components of a building past their breaking point.
One of the things we're most worried about in New York is that the short buildings, the 6 or 10-story unreinforced masonry buildings, have resonance frequencies that's very close to the period of the waves that we expect from a scenario earthquake. If that's indeed the case, then those buildings are the ones that are going to be most severely damaged. So those are the buildings we're most worried about.
Scientists are less worried about New York's skyscrapers, like the Empire State Building. Although it wasn't designed with earthquakes in mind, it was engineered to withstand hurricane-force winds.
The frame is designed to stay together even as it's twisted and bent. Now, these kinds of buildings are designed to take it and give a little bit.
Although they can't completely rule out the possibility of collapse, engineers believe this flexibility means most skyscrapers would still be standing when the shaking stops. But the twisting of these steel skeletons adds an unexpected dimension to the disaster. As the frame bends, the rigid exterior doesn't. The flexing steel cracks the building's facade. The Empire State Building showers Fifth Avenue with a lethal rain of limestone and glass. On buildings around the city, stone ornaments and statues become nothing more than highly ornate projectiles.
In a major quake in New York City, I would expect that an enormous amount of brick and glass would come off these buildings and hit people in the street.
Standing watch over the disaster in New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty is facing down her first major earthquake. The city's most famous lady is feeling the full force of the shock. The most recognizable part of the statue is also her most vulnerable, her slender outstretched arm with its heavy torch. Just as energy from the flick of a wrist can cause a bullwhip to make a mighty crack, shaking at the base of the statue is amplified as it reaches the narrow, more flexible arm.
My guess is that the Statue of Liberty might lose her arm, but the statue itself is steel framed, and the steel frame was designed by one of the great engineers of all time, Gustav Eiffel, who also designed the Eiffel Tower. So the Statue of Liberty might be severely damaged, but would probably survive.
No matter what time of day it strikes, a New York earthquake will catch thousands of people underground. Are the subways a safe place to be when the earth starts to move? Riding out a New York earthquake above ground would be terrifying. But the prospect of being trapped underground plays to the most primal of human fears. Imagine thousands of rush hour commuters trapped along the city's nearly 600 miles of track. Dozens could be killed on crowded platforms, struck by falling debris. Such destruction is less likely in places where the tunnels are bored through solid rock, since the vibrations won't crack the rock. But many parts of New York's subway system were built using the cut and cover technique, in which a trench is excavated in order to lay the tracks, and then columns are erected to hold up the reconstructed street above. In 1995, when a 6.8 magnitude quake struck Kobe, Japan, the roadway above the Daikai subway station buckled due to the failure of reinforced concrete columns holding up the street from below. It provides a preview of what could happen if the big one hits New York City.
I'm standing at the tracks at Grand Central Terminal in New York. Behind me, extending way out there, is actually Park Avenue. The tracks run under Park Avenue. These columns support the building above me. Notice that They're primarily verticals. They would sway in a major earthquake. The bracing that's here is actually fairly thin, but there is some. These are called K-braces. And of course, they can't extend too heavily over the tracks because the trains have to be here. It should withstand a Richter 5.5 earthquake quite successfully. In a really big earthquake, somewhere around magnitude 7, these columns would begin to fail. It would make it very, very difficult for the people to get out, and there could be some serious casualties, even fatalities.
Subways aren't the only tunnels New Yorkers should be worried about. New York's 3 critical water tunnels all pass through a potentially active fault zone. So do some of the tunnels that more than 350,000 commuters drive through every day.
The Queens Midtown Tunnel was drilled right through a minor fault line. So in the event of a serious quake, let's say approaching a 7 magnitude quake in this area, there are scientists who say the tunnels would snap like glass tubes.
That worst-case scenario is possible, but not the most likely.
If you're driving through the tunnel and the big one happens, you might get a crack in the wall of the tunnel. The tunnel is only about 30 or 40 feet below the surface of the water, so the water would come in fairly slowly, but would rise steadily. Don't stay in your car. Get out of the car, get out of the tunnel. You're going to have to walk.
If New York loses its tunnels, its trains, and its bridges during a massive earthquake, it will compound what would already be a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. New York relies on a constant flow of trucks and trains to keep its people supplied. By some estimates, at any given time, there's only enough food on the island to keep the population fed for 1 week. Shortages would plague a post-earthquake New York for months.
Hospitals barely operational, electric power minimal, water supplies rationed, food rationed. The conditions would be exceedingly primitive, far more than all but a very small fraction of New Yorkers could ever imagine.
In the face of potential disaster, it's frightening to comprehend that scientists have little hope of predicting when the next New York earthquake will happen. But they are hoping to pinpoint where it might strike. They are desperate to discover which of the hundreds of faults in and around the city are dormant, and which are most likely to wreak seismic havoc.
If we can identify the faults that actually have the activity, we will then know for building purposes, for putting in pipelines, for transmission lines, what you're going to avoid, because those are the places that are going to have the activity on them.
For decades, the primary suspect was the Ramapo Fault System, which extends northeast from New Jersey, crossing into New York State just north of the city. Some of the earthquakes in recent history seemed to match up with these faults, although the correlation wasn't perfect. And geologists who took a close look at the faults couldn't see any signs of recent activity. But clearly, there are active faults in the region. Something caused the magnitude 5.5 earthquake in 1884, and all of the smaller quakes in recent history. To figure out which of the faults in the New York region have the potential to unleash killer quakes, you have to get out of the city. Harriman State Park, 40 miles north of Manhattan. These 75,000 acres of wilderness are the laboratory for geologist Alec Gates. He's been mapping the rocks in the area for almost 2 decades, and in the process, he recently made an exciting discovery.
We were mapping out these rocks, and all of a sudden we discovered that there were these bunch of faults. Then you got to the next step, was to look at the satellite images of the area, and you could see the faults extended for miles, for up to 10 miles long. These were big faults.
In comparison to the sharply northeast trending Ramapo Fault, there are a number of faults in the park that angle more to the northwest. This is a key difference, because in a given region, faults that run in the same direction were likely formed at the same time by the same geologic forces. In a sense, they're part of the same family. If one fault in the family is active, chances are the others are too. And these faults in the park share a family resemblance with the ones directly under New York City.
The faults that you see in Harriman State Park are the same family of faults. They have the same orientation, the same age, the same characteristics as those in New York City.
So if Gates could find evidence that the faults in Harriman State Park were active, then he would know that the faults running right underneath Manhattan, including the one under 125th Street, were the ones New Yorkers should be watching. Gates found the evidence hiding in plain sight. In the Northeast, most surface rocks are rounded, their edges smoothed by the glaciers that dominated this area during the last ice age. But along the fault lines in Harriman State Park, the rocks tell a different story.
Here's a place where you can see the whole front of the hill is covered with rubble. Now, this rubble is all angular in shape. And rubble around here, because we had a glacier come through here and didn't retreat till about 12,000 years ago, most rocks around here are rounded. They call them fieldstones. But in this case, these rocks are all angular. And the only way those could have been made is after the glacier retreated. The glacier retreated about 12,000 years ago, and that means these rocks probably were created by the earthquake activity on the fault over the past 12,000 years, which in geological terms is relatively recent. This is what tells you that this fault is potentially still active.
Gates also discovered other northwest trending faults south of New York City. And like matching a suspected perpetrator with a documented crime, the final piece in the puzzle was to match up these newly mapped faults with the epicenters of earthquakes from the past. It was a match.
And so that was the excitement that took place, was to see that we actually found active faults on the east, which you usually just never see, that might be coming through this area. We can put your fingers on them.
In fact, when Gates traced one of these newly documented faults, it led him right to the epicenter of the 1884 earthquake.
And the whole system extends to the offshore. So if you were to peel away the water, you'd be able to see those faults extending out here underneath the Atlantic Ocean, just offshore of Coney Island. And those would be the faults. They'd be big enough faults that any stresses you add to this area because of plates, that's where it's going to break. Nobody had any clue where the next earthquake was going to take place in this area. They could be anywhere. Well, the big thing about these is we can see where the earthquakes might take place, as opposed to just, well, they take place any place. And that was the way it was before.
Still, just knowing where the faults are won't save New York City. If the big one struck tomorrow, the Big Apple would find itself woefully unprepared. Failure to heed the chorus of warnings about the earthquake threat has left the city vulnerable to an epic disaster.
You have the picture of Manhattan, the streets clogged and impassable with debris, with the subway tunnels ruptured, the old gas lines rupturing, igniting fires, as happened in San Francisco in the quake out there, that can't be fought because you can't reach them. There's no water in the hydrants to put them out. No communication left. Imagine that. Manhattan devastated, burning, lawless. It is a frightening scenario.
It's a picture of a disaster millions of years in the making, lurking underground, slowly building, capable of striking New York at any moment.
接下来，如何在冰天雪地中挨过1100英里的长途跋涉？让过来人为你现身说法。愚人的搏斗制作人的最新力作《超强狗雪橇大赛》就在全新再发现，接着播出。